Our next speaker is Annie Korin, who is the co-director of the Institute for Analysis, Global Security, and editor of Energy Security. She is also the chair of Set America Free Coalition. But the thing that I really hold, the reason I hold her in high regard is she actually goes out in the streets and convinces people, for example, the hybrid electric plug-ins are the way to go. She's really a hands-on person that has made an enormous contribution to better understanding the critical importance of shifting away from oil to renewables. She likes methanol, which is fine.
All right, the bottom line is that we're not going to be able to win the war against radical Islam as long as we are funding the other side of the war. 80% of the world's oil reserves are in countries in which radical Islam is on the rise. If you look at how much of the world's oil reserves are in the Middle East, that's about 2/3 of world oil reserves. So we are in a situation where we are importing more and more oil every day. During the Arab oil embargo, we imported about 30% of our oil. Today we import 60%, and that ratio is growing. Now we are always going to need oil. We are always going to use oil. This is made out of oil. This is probably made out of oil. Most everything you see or touch or use in your life was certainly either brought to you by oil or has an oil component to it. But the key is we have to take oil and do to it what technology once did to salt. Salt was once a strategic commodity. Wars were fought over salt. Geopolitical stature was determined by control or access to salt. But what happened was with the advent of electricity and refrigeration, salt lost its strategic value. You no longer needed it to preserve meat. And so we like salt, we use salt. I'm sure there's salt over there. You could walk away with it and nobody's going to send the police after you. It's no longer a strategic commodity. We need to do the same thing to oil, and in much the same way. What we need to do, the reason that oil is a strategic commodity is because of its use in the transportation sector. Right? 2/3 of U.S. oil consumption is in the transportation sector. The bulk of growth in oil consumption in the developing world is because of the transportation sector. And there is no choice in the transportation sector. It's almost completely petroleum dependent. So we need to introduce choice and competition into the transportation sector. And you heard from Jim about the basic way that we can do that. 2 primary methods. 1, liquid fuel choice. This is why we absolutely need flexible fuel vehicles. If you were going to pass one energy policy in Congress, I would say the most critical and most strategic would be require every new car sold in this country to be a flexible fuel vehicle. It's a feature that costs less than $100 a vehicle, and it lets the consumer choose at the pump between gasoline, ethanol, methanol, and other alcohols. It's an absolutely critical thing to do. Every single car GM sells in Brazil is a flex fuel vehicle. Brazil went from 0 to 70% of new cars being flex fuel vehicles in 3 years. This is very low-hanging fruit. We have to do this. So when you have that platform, you have a platform on which fuels can compete. That sends a very strong signal to investors in alternative fuels. It says, all right, year to year, the potential market for your fuels is going to grow. Now go off and compete. Electrifying the transportation sector, as Jim mentioned, is another absolutely critical thing to do. And thankfully, with developments in battery technology, there's a lot of motion towards this right now. And I think the most important policy toward moving this forward and getting plug-in hybrids out on the road is the policy that worked with hybrids. Tax credits for consumers. Double the tax credits for plug-in hybrids as compared to the tax credits for hybrids for an equivalently sized car. You're creating a very strong pull in the market. And right now in battery technology, this country is pretty far behind. Just to give you an illustration, Japan, China, and Korea are way far ahead of us in terms of battery technology. When you talk about, people say, oh, batteries are so expensive. Well, look at what China is doing. We're talking about 10 kilowatt-hour batteries. These are batteries that can take a mid-sized car about 20 miles on a charge for a $2,500 price premium. That's not bad. We're nowhere near that. Our prices are at least 3 times that number. All right? But I'd much rather be importing batteries from China until we get ourselves back in shape than oil from the Middle East. Now, we have to remember, why are we talking about reducing oil consumption overall? Why didn't you hear people talk today about diversifying oil supplies? The first reaction after 9/11 was we're too dependent on the Middle East. Let's go get oil from other places. And that works, but it works only as a stopgap solution to buy you time to do other things. The reason it only works as a stopgap solution is if you look at what's happened, first of all, it expands the sphere of the Middle East.